Hi, I'm Mark David Gerson. Welcome to Stories and Reflections, where my stories are also yours. I had a routine cancer screening last week, and although I don't have all the results back yet, I'm not overly concerned. It was routine. But it did remind me of another screening I had about a dozen years ago, and that one wasn't routine. And at the time, I remember having moments of calm when I was certain everything would be okay, and moments of understandable, profound anxiety, worrying that things might not be. And at one point, I remember asking myself, if the worst happens, if I am going to die sooner rather than later, what is it that I want to make sure I do before I die? And the answer, which came from someplace deep within, surprised me. Because the answer was write another novel. At that point, I had written 3 novels. I'd written the 3 novels of what I was then calling the Quintana trilogy, the Moon Quest, the Star Quest, and the Sun Quest. And as I mentioned in another episode, I was completely certain that there were no more stories in that series. And I had no other ideas for other novels, so I didn't really know what to think. I was in the midst of preparing to go to LA for a business trip at the time, and I thought, well, I'll think about it when I get back. But the voice of our muse can be pretty insistent and persistent, and what I felt really strongly was the time to start is now. So once I got to LA, I took myself off to a Starbucks in Santa Monica, and I sat down to write. All I have is a very vague notion for an opening scene. And the scene takes place in a cemetery. A woman very loosely based on my mother has just died, and her oldest friend is at the graveside. In my conception for this story, both her oldest friend named Esther and the main character Sarah, as teenagers in the 30s, the story is set in the 90s, as teenagers in the 30s, they both had great plans. Sarah wanted to be a famous writer, and Esther wanted to be a famous artist. But, women in the 30s, the end of the Depression, just before the war, life got in the way. They both got married and had families, and that was the end of that. And in my conception of the story, Sarah is standing at Esther's grave and has an epiphany. And the epiphany is, I'm in my 60s. My best friend has died with her dreams unlived. I can't let my dreams die with me like Esther did. I have to find a way to become the writer I always said I wanted to be. So that's the scene I set out to write. And I already have a title. The title of the book was going to be Sarah's Year, and it would be a year in the life of Sarah after the funeral as she begins to live the dream that she had left behind so long ago. So I open my laptop and I sit down to write. And as I write this scene, the story changes. Suddenly, there's another character, a very key character who shows up, Esther's son. Until that moment, I didn't even know she had a son. And the story takes a whole different turn. And the new story is the one I begin to write. I begin to write the story, and as I write the story, I am kind of confused because this is no longer a year in the life of Sarah, so how does this title, Sarah's Year, make any sense? But I talk in all my writing classes and books for writers that our books are their own sentient thinking entities. And really, our stories are smarter than we are. And I just kept sensing that the title was right. The title is right. The title is right. Don't change the title. Well, I keep writing, and the title still feels not right, and the title still feels not right, and I keep second guessing myself and second guessing myself. And I get to one of the final scenes of the first draft, and suddenly the title is right. The story is smarter than I am. The story does know itself better than I do. When we trust that our stories are smarter than we are. The magic that shows up, the miracles that show up, the synchronicities that show up are mind-boggling. There was a very well-known high school in Montreal, in the Jewish immigrant neighborhood of Montreal, called Baron Bing High School. Many famous Canadians went there. My mother was a student there. And I decided to use Baron Bing as part of the story. But just a passing part of the story, just the fact that as teens, Esther and the Sarah character went to Baron Bing High School. And I'm telling this to my sister, and Susan says, "Do you know about Anne Savage and the murals?" And I said, "Who was Anne Savage and what murals?" And she says, "When our mother was in Baron Bing, Anne Savage was the art teacher there, and she started a project to cover all the institutional green walls with murals that the students painted. And our mother was one of the students who painted those murals." So I began to do some research and discovered that Anne Savage was the real art teacher. But more than that, Anne Savage became a very well-known Canadian artist. And Anne Savage and the murals became a key part of the story because of a seemingly random conversation I had with my sister. Now, the real-life story for Anne Savage is that sometime after my mother graduated from Baron Bing, Anne Savage was promoted from art teacher to school board art consultant. The story gets even kind of crazier because one of my best friends in high school, quite a few years later, his mother was the art consultant for the same school board. So I messaged Greg and I said, "Did your mother know Anne Savage?" And he wrote back and he said, "Oh my God, Anne Savage was her mentor." And so Anne Savage was in my life kind of secondhand when I was in high school. Anne Savage was in my life when I was growing up because she influenced my mother. The story brought Anne Savage to me and made her part of the story, a key and important part of the story. And I love that synchronicity, and there's so many other synchronicities. One involves the Anna Leonowens from The King and I. Anna was a real person. She was governess to the kids of the King of Siam now Thailand. And she is a heroine to Esther and Sarah as they're growing up. They read the book. She becomes a powerful role model and heroine. What I didn't know when I allowed Anna to be Esther and Sarah's heroine was that Anna Leonowens, when she retired, she moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And Halifax, Nova Scotia, is one of the two settings in Sarah's year. It's set in Montreal and in Nova Scotia. I didn't know that when I began writing the book, when I determined that Anna would be this inspiration, this heroine. But it gets better. Because not only did Anna retire to Halifax, when she was in Halifax, she founded the art college that would become NSCAD University. And one of my characters in Sarah's year is a student at NSCAD. Another weird synchronicity. But it gets better because after Anna left Nova Scotia, she moved to Montreal, where my story is set, where she died, where she is buried. So all these interesting little threads that I did not know when I began writing, they all kind of wove themselves together to create this amazing tapestry, this blend of fiction and real people that Sarah's year would become. So here's another weird synchronicity, I guess. Anne Savage's nephew was Galt MacDermot, and Galt MacDermot was the Montreal-born composer of the musical Hair. And Anne Savage was also related to great-grandniece of one of Canada's fathers of Confederation. The fathers of Confederation in Canada are kind of like the founding fathers in the U.S. So why am I telling you this story? This is the question I asked last week, too, and it's also a question for me because one of the ways these podcasts come together is I get an inspiration for a story I want to tell you. So that's the stories part of the stories and reflections. But I don't generally know what the reflection is going to be. Why am I telling the story? Why am I telling it for me, and why am I telling it for you? I think two reflections I have on this story. One is directly related to the content of the story. Sarah has given up her dream of being a writer. She's the daughter of immigrants at the tail end of the Depression, just before the Second World War, and gets married because that's what women did in those days. And her dreams get lost. And in her 60s, Esther has died, dreams unfulfilled. And there are other aspects of Esther's life that also speak to that lack of fulfillment, but I won't spoil the story for you by telling you those. But Sarah discovers in her 60s that she isn't too old to live the dream, to pick up the dream she abandoned in her late teens, early 20s. It's never too late to follow your dreams. And she becomes a successful author, a very successful author at that age. It's never too late to follow your dreams. And the other character, Esther's son, Bernie. And Esther's son, Bernie, by the way, is a character I did not conceive in my original cemetery scene as the opening. He just showed up as I'm writing. And he and Sarah become two of the principal characters. And as Sarah discovers that she can reclaim her dreams, she can become the writer she always dreamed of becoming and thought that that dream was gone, Bernie discovers a dream he didn't even know. And I think I've talked a little bit about this idea before when I was talking in a past episode about me not knowing that I had this dream to be a writer like Sarah. But I didn't know that. I was hiding from that. And Bernie is hiding as well from his dream that he discovers in the 72 hours after his mother's funeral that he spends with her oldest and best friend. So it's never too late to follow your dreams. It's never too late to discover your dreams. And I think that's the other takeaway from this story. And the third takeaway is that when we get out of the way of our stories, I've talked about this before, when we get out of the way of our stories, certainly the stories we're writing, but also the stories we're living, those stories prove themselves to be so much smarter, so much wiser than we could ever imagine possible. So let me leave you with these questions. How can you free your story onto the page in your life to live more freely through you? How can you let go into it? How can you allow all the things you don't know you know to emerge? The other question is, what dreams of yours are stuffed at the back of a drawer? What dreams of yours have you decided are unreasonable, unreachable, impractical? Whatever those are, I invite you to reach your hand into the back of that drawer and pull them out. Reawaken them, reignite them, rekindle them. It's never too late. Whether you're 20 or 80, it's never too late. Never, ever, ever too late to follow your dreams. Thanks for joining me for Stories and Reflections today. I hope you found moments in my stories that touched something in yours. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And for more of my stories and help telling yours, check out my books at markdavidgerson.com or from online booksellers worldwide. Until next time, don't forget that you're a storyteller too, and keep telling your stories. The intro and outro music for today's episode is Heartwarming by Kevin MacLeod from Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons.